Good afternoon and good morning to everyone from coast to coast, and welcome to today's webinar, the 2016 State of Sustainability in Higher Education, exploring the latest trends and findings across the life cycle of facilities. My name is Eric Nolan. I'm the Senior Marketing Manager at Sightlines. I will also be your moderator for today's session, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us. Similar to last year, we're happy to say that we have a record-breaking audience with us today. We have hundreds of facility, sustainability, and business officers from institutions across North America, and we're thrilled to be spending this time with each and every one of you. Today's session will explore the latest in higher education sustainability, trends, achievements, and opportunities for continuous improvement, and will feature Jennifer Andrews, Project Director for Sustainability at the University of New Hampshire Sustainability Institute, and Heather Finnegan, Product Manager for Sustainability at Sightlines. In a moment, I will share with you how to gather more information about both Jen and Heather, but for now, I'd like to express how excited we are to have the opportunity to hear from these two industry leaders, as both have years of experience supporting the higher education sustainability movement and were key contributors to this year's State of Sustainability report. Speaking of the State of Sustainability report, as I'm sure a lot of you already know, this year's edition is now available for download. So if you want to get your hands on a copy of the report or simply just learn more about our suite of campus sustainability solutions, please don't hesitate to visit the Sightlines website following today's session to check out all of those resources that we have available. Now let's quickly review today's agenda. First is a quick introduction and an answer to the most pivotal question: why do we study the state of sustainability, and ultimately what was discovered? Then Jen and Heather will lead us through a review of the 2016 findings by highlighting each stage of the building life cycle. And lastly, we'll set aside some time at the end of the presentation to respond to any questions or comments that are submitted along the way. With this in mind, I'd like to remind you if you have any questions or comments during the presentation for either Jen or Heather, please don't hesitate to share those with us as you think of them. We'd like this to be an interactive session, and we very much look forward to answering any questions that come up along the way. I'll be monitoring them throughout the presentation, and as I mentioned before, we'll do our best to address each and every one of them towards the end of the presentation. To submit a question or comment, simply enter it in the questions box on your GoToWebinar window pane, and they will be sent directly to us. To answer one question up front that we typically receive following today's session, each of you will receive an email that contains links to both the presentation slides and webinar recording for your continued engagement with this material. We'll also be sure to include some complimentary content that we think you might find valuable, so keep an eye out for that email tomorrow. And lastly, like you see on the screen, for anyone looking for more insight into strategies that have worked or to explore how institutions across the country are putting data into action to address campus challenges, the handout section on the GoToWebinar window pane will be the place for you. Handouts will give you instant access to complimentary resources such as previous webinar presentations, member success stories shared at industry conferences, and a speaker bio document if you'd like to learn more about our presenters today. You'll also find a complimentary case study from Fort Lewis College about how they were able to leverage sustainability reporting data to bring campus stakeholders together. You can check out these resources at any time during the session, and we encourage you to do so. And with that, I'll wrap up here, and I'll pass it off to Jen to get us started. So take it away, Jen.
Thanks so much, Eric, and thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. We're really excited to share with you the findings of this year's report and to hear your comments and questions and suggestions around it. My role for this hour is to provide a bit of context and framing, and then I'm going to hand it over to Heather to walk us through some of the report-specific findings, and then come back at the end to talk a little bit about the kind of broader conclusions. Before I get into the specifics of the report, though, I wanted to talk just for a couple minutes about how it came to be, so I hope you'll bear with just a little bit of quick storytelling, because I think it's useful background info. This is the second State of Sustainability report that Sightlines and the University of New Hampshire Sustainability Institute have worked on, that we've worked on together, and we do plan to have it be a continued annual series moving forward. And so just a bit of background on the University of New Hampshire Sustainability Institute. We are the campus sustainability office for UNH. So like many of you on the webinar, we're responsible for working across campus with varied stakeholders to infuse sustainability into our curriculum and research, our governance, our engagement, across the board, our operations, obviously. And one aspect of my job specifically is to do all of that sort of data collection and reporting, working with our energy task force and our zero waste task force and all of those bodies across campus. So I, from sort of day to day, have that shared task, that perspective that bringing to this work. And the Institute has that perspective that it's bringing to this work. But we also have the benefit of being one of the first offices of sustainability established at a U.S. campus. We were founded in 1999. We have the real benefit of having a small endowment that helps provide stable funding for 4 of our core staff. And we have really a visionary leader in Dr. Tom Kelly, who founded this office, who really believes that the role of the Sustainability Institute should be, yes, supporting sustainability here on campus, but much more broadly supporting the work of our community, our sustainability and higher ed community. And so one example of that, as many of you know, is that UNHSI worked with the nonprofit Cleaner Cool Planet more than 15 years ago, and I actually worked at Cleaner Cool Planet then, to develop the campus carbon calculator as a tool to help us all better understand and manage our carbon footprints. And so when 3 years ago the board of that nonprofit decided to sunset the organization, the Sustainability Institute took on a significant role continuing to manage and support the calculator, which by that time had grown to be not only the Excel spreadsheet, which many of you use, but also a web-based version on which, well, it's a web-based version based on the Campus Carbon Calculator Excel sheet called Carbon Map. And the reason for moving from that Excel tool to the web-based Carbon Map was multifaceted. Partly it was about a better user experience, making updates easier and having more flexibility and more functionality. But very largely, it was about a vision of what it could mean to have all of the user data that had been sort of, was on 1,000 computers across 1,000 campuses in the U.S., to have that all aggregated into a single platform where it would be available for research and we could mine it for trends and for stories. We could use it as a sort of mirror for the user community. And so we meaning Cleaner Cool Planet at the time, thought that that can be a powerful tool to help us advance not only the efforts of individual campuses who are using it, but to advance our collective efforts. CSUP was not a data analytics firm, and we had no experience with developing online tools, but Sightlines did. And nearly 10 years ago, Sightlines approached us at Cleaner Cool Planet and offered to work together with us to help advance the role of data in campus climate action, which was a big focus for us. And so they turned out to be an absolutely vital partner in creating the Carbon Map tool, the online tool. And so when UNH Sustainability Institute took over, again, sort of stewarding the Campus Carbon Calculator and Carbon Map in 2014, the conversation about thought leadership began with us and with Sightlines. So there was no longer any formal partnership around either the calculator or Carbon Map about managing those tools. But we started talking about how we could collaborate on research and analysis that would make a good use of the universe of data that we, and by we I mean the sustainability and higher ed community again, that data that we've labored long and hard to develop over the past 2 decades. And so the results of that collaboration can be seen in this report series. And so I just want to say I'm personally grateful to have gotten to know such talented and dedicated colleagues like Heather and Robin Zhu, who worked on this report. And I'm also professionally grateful for the continued commitment to strategic thinking and analysis that Sightlines has demonstrated on behalf of our entire user community. So that's the story behind the report. Why do the report? Why study the state of sustainability? Again, it really was the sense of let's use this information that we have better to reflect how are we doing collectively. So it's to assess our progress as a whole, to celebrate our achievements, to pinpoint areas where we could have a greater impact perhaps if we altered or augmented our collective approach, like what can we do better. So that's really the why in a nutshell. One other quick note on that I wanted to say, for some of you, as for me, it might feel like there's maybe a tiny bit of a disconnect between the title, the state of sustainability, which is really broad, and the focus, which is somewhat narrowly about campus operations, and it's a little heavy on the environmental impact, less of the social. So the goal is to be able to broaden this over time so that we really are examining the state of sustainability and not purely campus environmental performance. And we hope that you will be part of the conversation with us over time and help us to figure out how to do that. So that's that piece. I want to talk a little bit more about the framework for this year's report. So I just talked about how over time we want to broaden our focus and our framework. An effort to broaden is really part of what drove our theme and our framework for this year's report. Last year we focused more or less on annual building energy and emissions trends. This year we talk about that, but we wanted to think about it a little differently. We wanted to think about it across the life cycle of our campus buildings and to include different aspects of operations and to think more broadly about our impacts. And so this that you see on the slide, I think, is one useful framework for that. And this was actually developed last summer by a UNHSI sustainability fellow named Brendan Helbish. He's a University of Missouri student and an activist. And he worked all last summer with the University of Kentucky's Shane Tedder and with faculty and staff from the University of Kentucky and with consultant Jason DeLong, who's a great Kentucky colleague. And this was such a cool project. Brendan developed a methodology for calculating not simply the annual carbon emissions of campus buildings and not simply an analysis of the embodied carbon, but actually a comprehensive accounting framework for the total carbon footprint for each of UK's buildings from construction to present. So he developed this graphic to illustrate the paradigm in which he was working. So this involved taking a life cycle approach, obviously, recognizing that buildings go through phases and that there are varied impacts in each phase. So construction, we know, has a big one because you're doing all of that purchasing and you're using heavy equipment. You're a lot of embodied carbon in the materials. And then you sort of get into operations phase, which, especially if it's a well-built building, is a lot lower. Right, and then you have these periods where you know you need some renovation, some retrofits, some significant improvement, some capital reinvestment. Then again, you're going to get those spikes in impact, again, due to purchasing and also labor. And then you get to the end of the building, or the end of the building as it is, and you do demolition, and you start over, and so then you see another big spike. And so we wanted to look at the impact across those, what we were looking at as 4 phases of the life cycle: the construction, the operations, the capital reinvestment, and the demolition. Next, yeah, okay, so that conceptual framework is really a fundamental shift compared to how we are measuring our impact now, especially in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Because what we typically do for our greenhouse gas emissions is sort of measure, like this orange box here, a portion of emissions and just a portion of the operational emissions, not from the other 3 life cycles. And so this is just a sliver that we normally do. In terms of time, it's a somewhat arbitrary slice of time. I mean, we pick our baseline based on best available data, or usually it's best available data. And, you know, so that's important, but it obviously leaves out a whole chunk going backward and going forward of what the impact of that building is. And we're used to sort of thinking about our footprint in terms of going back as far as our baseline and no further. It kind of blows your mind and makes you think about things differently. You think about the impact, you know, in terms of its life cycle. So in addition to, we're not going to talk a whole bunch more about that time notion, that carbon debt notion, although I will say that Brendan is writing up a paper about his findings and came up with some really cool ideas, and I think that's an important conversation for our community to have, so maybe stay tuned. But what we really focused on more in the report was about how it's also a slice in time, but it's also just a slice of the operational emissions. And there are pieces of the operational emissions footprint that are not included in our greenhouse gas inventory typically. And that's for good reason, of course. We're all measuring and reporting based on existing protocols and standards, and those protocols and standards were developed with things like markets and regulation in mind, as opposed to sort of more, I want to say philosophical, but sort of more conceptual or big picture things. They were created to do very specific things, and they were also created with feasibility in mind. Feasibility in terms of getting the data and feasibility in terms of modeling emissions. So the upshot is that we end up not accounting for a big chunk of our impact. And well, so how big? I mean, we sort of know we're leaving stuff out, but how much are we leaving out? When we look at studies from schools in the UK who have tried to do this sort of comprehensive look at their emissions, we see that, you know, we are including commuting, travel, some other things, but by not including all of our procurement, including our construction procurement, we're leaving out a big chunk, more than a third of our total impact every year. So again, this year's report aims to take a broader view, and since we don't have emissions data to apply across the different phases of the life cycle, we looked around to see what data was available. And the good news, of course, is that thanks to the hard work and leadership from lots of individuals and institutions and organizations, really over the years, we have a lot of data spread out across what I often think of as like a campus sustainability data ecosystem. And so from this report, we sort of dug into corners, different pockets of that ecosystem. And we use publicly available data from the sources that you see here, and we also were able to, upon request, they gave us some specific data sets as well. So these organizations, they're such important resources for our community. I'm so grateful to all of them. I want to say thank you to Sightlines, obviously, but AEC, the National Association of Educational Procurement, USGBC, an important partner on this, Second Nature, of course, and the Living Building Institute, all of whom provided key data for us to try to get a better understanding of where we are at across the life cycle. So that's the framework. I am going to be quiet now and turn it over to Heather to walk us through some of the actual findings from that data.
Thanks, Jen. We're looking forward to this conversation with all of you attendees and hoping that the conversation really continues over the next year as folks become familiar with the findings from these diverse data sets and start to really talk about the next steps forward. When we are considering the findings of the report, we're going to walk through in order, essentially following that first chart that Jen shared with you where it starts with the construction of a building and the sustainability attributes of that construction process. When we looked across those databases, we actually started with the Sightlines database, which includes institutions across the United States and Canada. And what we first investigated about construction was the pattern of construction over time. So you'll see here that this is the percent of gross square feet across the campuses in our Sightlines database. And probably the first thing that jumps out to you about this data trend is that there's two major peaks in construction. That first peak between 1960 to 1970 was when there was a great deal of baby boomers starting to attend campus and enrollment was growing very rapidly, and campuses responded by building quite a bit of additional square footage to accommodate these extra students. The second boom that you see, centered around 2005, is one that we'll pay particular attention to today as we move through this data set, because that second building boom really coincided with the invigoration and growth of sustainability as a process and as a department maybe on a lot of the campuses that we work with. During that second boom in construction, it coincided very nicely with the onset of the LEED rating system. And this LEED rating system really created a framework for how to construct a building using approachable and reasonable construction methods that were also sustainable. What we have here is a project count. This is higher ed certified projects in the United States and Canada over time. And the first trend you'll notice is that after the first certified building in higher ed in 2002, there was a very quick growth in the use and certification under LEED across higher ed campuses, peaking in 2012 with over 400 buildings certified in just that 1 year across higher ed in North America. Interestingly, since 2012, we're seeing a slow decline in the number of certified buildings over time. And as researchers, our initial take on this was, well, you might anticipate that because there has been a decline in overall construction during that time, which we saw on the chart before. But as we speak with our members, with the institutions that were early adapters of LEED, we are learning other trends and behaviors on campus. Essentially, USGBC, in creating the LEED rating system, has in many ways made sustainable construction the status quo because it was so readily adapted and so many of the facets of the rating system became almost standard practice in the construction industry that many campuses now are still following a lot of those best practices and even using the LEED checklist, but not necessarily going after certification. So we think we're seeing two factors here. The first, that there's just a little bit less construction than there was during that 2005 peak, but also that campuses have internalized much of the process built within LEED, but are not necessarily going after that certification any longer. And as researchers, we found this exciting on one hand, because that means that campuses have really integrated this into their process in a lot of ways. But also troubling on the other as we try to collect data about the sustainability progress of institutions. As institutions choose not to certify buildings, it really will become harder to track the construction patterns of institutions of higher ed in the country. Interestingly, at the same time that we're seeing a little bit of this decline in actual certification, there's also been the emergence of some additional green building rating systems. Many of you might be familiar with the Living Building Challenge. Excuse me. This rating system creates what I'm going to call stretch goals for green construction, whereas USGBC was really looking to integrate sustainability and make it mainstream, if you will, through the LEED process. The Living Building Challenge likes to say that they're on the cusp of progress. They always want to be pushing the envelope forward, and in fact, the rating system has changed many times over the course of its existence to make it more stringent. You can certify a building under this rating system by earning petals within it: energy, water, site, etc. And what's interesting is that despite the fact that this is really cutting edge and trying to move builders and architects forward, there have been some certified and some registered projects under this more stringent criteria. For instance, they have 3 rating systems living within the Living Building Challenge. The first is net zero, in which a building would aim to perform in such a way that it earned the energy petal, one of those 7 petals. Amongst our membership at Sightlines, one of our institutions, Millersville University, is working towards this on a welcome center that's being constructed at the moment. But you'll see that there's not any certified projects yet in higher ed. The next version of their rating system is petal, in which an institution may choose to earn 3 of those petals or work towards earning 3 of those 7 petals. And to date, there's 1 project certified under this. One of our Sightlines members, Berea College, has a green dormitory that has certified, and several other projects are coming behind and are registered and aiming for that certification. And then finally, the most stringent, earning 7 petals in the Living Building Challenge. In higher ed, we see 1 project certified with 19 more registered. That 1 certified project is at Smith College, and of course a big point of pride, because again, this is looking to really push the envelope on what is possible in green construction. This data collectively tells us a few things. Objectively, I think it says that higher ed has really focused on sustainable construction. They were early adapters of LEED, quickly certified many projects, and now institutions are even going after this more stringent criteria. So in a sense, this is an area in the life cycle where I think that higher ed has a lot to be proud of for their work to date. When we start thinking about buildings after they're constructed, what happens with that building later in its life, year after year, as it's operating and using resources? Our first take at this when we were analyzing the data was to think about the dollars that we spend in higher ed into utilities. So of the overall operating budget of institutions, in 2007, about 35% of those dollars were going towards utility costs. Excuse me. You'll see that in 2015 that number dropped to just about 31%, primarily driven by a decrease in unit costs of about 5% during that time period. So if energy costs less per unit, our initial concern after running these analyses is, what does this mean for the progress that institutions are making in that operations phase of the life cycle? Low unit costs mean that there's less financial incentive to maybe update systems, and could also mean that the payback period on those updates is longer. So we dug into this capital spending profile of our institutions, and you'll see that in 2007, just short of 60% of dollars were spent in that blue systems and envelope category, in addition to the gray infrastructure category. And these are systems that you can classically think of as having a direct impact on the energy consumption on campus. So about 60% of expenditures in 2007, but you see that number shrink slightly in 2015. Again, from a financial perspective, possibly cause for concern. But we're happy to report that from an energy consumption perspective, things are looking pretty good in higher ed over that time period, with an 8% reduction in consumption per unit space over that time period from 2007 to 15. So when you start to think about this collectively, you think there's some market forces working against the idea that campuses would invest into energy efficiency projects because the payback period is longer, the unit costs are cheaper. But despite maybe those financial kind of holdbacks from investing, campuses are continuing to make progress and to see change over time, which I think is something that the sustainability professionals can be really proud about advocating for. Even better, when you look at the emissions profile per unit space on campus, we see a 14% reduction in emissions attributable to purchased electricity and purchased fossil from 2007 to 15. A lot of that is driven by a change in fuel. So for instance, when we look at our database-wide trends in fuel mix, in 2007, just 66% of overall fuel use was natural gas. That changed very rapidly, considering that to change fuels it often requires infrastructure and system upgrades, from just 66% natural gas to 84% natural gas. So even though utility costs have been relatively low and capital spending hasn't shifted dramatically towards investing in systems and infrastructure, campuses really are making progress. They're updating their systems and the fuel that they take, and as a result, getting improvements in efficiency and emissions profile when you look collectively at the averages across the board. What's interesting on the left-hand side of this chart is the reduction we see in the red purchased electric emissions. Much like at the campus level, we've seen a great deal of fuel switching at the regional level. When you look at the fuels consumed to produce electricity for the grid, nearly every grid in the country has become significantly cleaner over time by switching, in some cases, to natural gas, but in many cases also expanding the renewable portfolio significantly. So on the operations side, much like on the construction side, there's some measurable progress that has been made in adapting sustainability and energy efficiency into the everyday campus operations in the US and Canada. Now the next phase of the life cycle that we'd like to think about is capital reinvestment. You'll remember that the introduction Jen provided showed that there's some peaks, partially through a building's aging and life cycle, that coincide with major capital investments, even minor capital investments in some cases, to either replace or improve systems, or to update a building to match the programmatic and educational needs on campus. So let's think a little bit about that capital reinvestment cycle. I'm going to take you back to the construction chart that I showed at the beginning of my section on construction life cycle. Again, you're going to see those two peaks. Here they're shown in gray. The first right around 1970, the second right around 2005. I'm going to walk you through step by step because it does have a lot on this chart, but I think you'll start to see a trend that we all need to be ready for in the future as sustainability professionals. So let's think about these 1970s buildings. They're now 50 plus years old in many cases. In that 50 plus years that they have been on our college campuses, they have had capital reinvestment needs. So for instance, about 25 years into their life cycle, they may have had their roof and electrical systems upgraded. About 5 years later, perhaps the exteriors and HVAC were upgraded or improved. And then later, plumbing. Now, as they're approaching the next cycle of need, these are all going to hit right around the 2025 to 2040 time period, meaning that we're going to need to drop capital, lots of capital dollars, into these aging buildings to make sure that they continue to run properly for the students they're educating. Now, this isn't anything unusual. Every building has needs over time. What makes this pattern unusual is this second peak in 2005. If we start to think about when those buildings will have their first set of system replacements, you're looking at dates just around the early 2030s to mid to 2040s. What's important about this is that these needs for these 2005 buildings are going to overlap in time with the second wave of needs for your 1970s buildings. So you might be sitting there thinking, all right, that sounds like an issue for finance and for the fundraisers, the folks who are dealing with big dollar spends and big dollar donations and bonds, et cetera, on campus. The truth is this issue has serious sustainability impacts because all of those investments collectively become a huge piece of the focus of college campuses over time. So again, we're looking here at the Sightlines database, and what we see is the growth in capital need over time. So I mentioned before that the first wave of needs in those buildings came in the late 90s, and we saw this peak to $4 billion across our database in capital that needed to be invested just to keep those buildings functional. It dipped off for a little while, but as we're moving towards that period in which all of those needs overlap, what we see is that in the 2030s, just for this select group of institutions, $7 billion in capital needs. Let's think for a minute about the implications of that from an environmental and a sustainability perspective. Lots of money will be invested into buildings, and in fact, we've already seen a shift in mentality on college campuses about how dollars are invested. So in the early phase of this analysis in 2007, the dollars were split about 50-50, half going towards improving existing buildings, half going towards building new space. Already in this time period between 07 and 15, we see a shift. Now we're getting closer to 60% of dollars going into those existing buildings. And given the fact that those needs are coming due that we just showed on the slide before, what we can anticipate is that this ratio will change even more over time. Now, this is one of those areas where, as a whole, perhaps there is more room for improvement from sustainability-minded individuals on campus in thinking about how we go about doing those projects in existing buildings in the most sustainable way. So you'll notice that the colors transfer over here. On the right, we're showing 86% of all certified higher ed projects in LEED were building design and construction. So these are new construction projects or major gut renos that are certified in the LEED rating system, which again, I think we can credit, given the data we've shown, with a lot of the progress that this sector has made in ingraining sustainability into the built environment on campus. What's a little bit less Less intense is the number of certified buildings certified under LEED O&M, which is operations and maintenance. This is a rating system that is specifically designed to encourage existing building owners to improve the performance of their buildings, and to do it in a regimented framework in which ideal sustainability parameters are set out by the LEED rating system. Just 2% of higher ed certified projects certify under that. Just 12% certify under ID+C, which is interior design and construction. These are projects that are mostly interior retrogrades or upgrades that the materials and the indoor air quality, etc., are really factored into the decision-making process about how those projects are undertaken. So collectively, campuses are now spending 55+% of capital dollars in existing buildings, but not really using established frameworks to certify the projects they're doing within those existing buildings the way that they are with new construction projects. So when we started analyzing this data, our mindset was, all right, when it comes to capital investment, this process of embedding sustainability attributes is not really formalized. We're not using those rating systems within LEED really measurably. So what are we doing? Because we know we're making progress in our buildings. Operations are improving. What we did was take a look at the survey data from the National Association of Educational Procurement. And they ask each year in that survey, does your institution have a formal green procurement policy? The reason this is of interest to us is because maybe institutions are choosing not to certify projects, but they have some internal mechanism for ensuring that they're making sustainable purchases as they complete capital reinvestment projects. So just 1/3 of respondents said that they in fact have these formal policies in place. Not ideal. On the good news front, those same respondents said even if we don't have formal procurement policies in place, about 50% of us are considering sustainability when we're purchasing construction services, and about 35% of us are considering sustainability when purchasing construction materials. So even if it's not formalized, you're not going after a rating, maybe you don't have a formal policy or institution, many buyers who are responsible for procuring the services and materials have it as a consideration. But I would argue there's a lot of room for improvement in that area, especially given that there's an increased focus on existing space spending, and we anticipate that focus on existing space will need to grow measurably in the coming years to prepare for the aging of those 1970s and 2005 buildings and how those needs will coincide with each other. So, one of the interesting dynamics of this idea of the building life cycle is that there's a lot of environmental impact from this built environment, but there's also potential to back away from some of that environmental footprint if the institution decides to remove space from its building inventory. One of the ways to do that is through demolition. Now, when Jen showed that first chart, she mentioned that there's a pretty significant peak in carbon emissions associated with demolition. That's because of the processes involved, running the equipment to demolish the building, but also because of the waste disposal that's associated with demolition. Now, many of you on the phone are probably thinking, well, I see a lot of construction on campus. We have a new building every couple of years, even on a small campus. I don't see much demolition. You would not be alone in that. So when we look at, excuse me, the construction and demolition profile across our Sightlines database, what we saw in 2007 was that close to 25 million gross square feet were added just in that 1 year across those 350 institutions. In the same year, less than 2 million gross square feet were taken offline. Now you might say, well, my campus is growing. When we actually look across campuses in America, there are some that are growing steadily and have increased enrollment and might need additional space. But many of the campuses that were constructing new space, it was really to meet changing programmatic demands. It wasn't because the student enrollment was ballooning. So there is certainly potential to take space offline without affecting the academic outlook of the institution. But that option has not really been executed a great deal in recent years in higher ed. Even in 2015, when we saw a decline in this new space brought online as that building boom sort of died down, we still weren't seeing any major increase in the demolition of buildings. So in this year in red, you see that 143 buildings in our database were added in 15, just 60 taken offline. The other thing to note about this pattern of construction and demolition is that the buildings built in recent years tend to be large, 74,000 gross square feet on average. The buildings demolished tend to be really quite small, 11,000 gross square feet. So even if you were to take off a similar number of buildings as put on, the size and the environmental impact of those buildings can be quite significant. Many of you on the phone probably have neutrality goals at your home campus, where each and every year you're trying to get closer to carbon emissions of 0. We all know that as you calculate those greenhouse gas inventories, you might be making great progress. Maybe your buildings are becoming more efficient, your grid's cleaner, you've switched to a lower emitting fuel, but for every new building that's built on campus, it's having an impact that's really counterintuitive to all those behavioral and structural changes that the sustainability professionals are pushing for day in and day out. So one of the recommendations that has come out of this year's report, as well as last year's report, is this idea of pursuing policies that might move us closer to this idea of net zero growth. Whether there's the potential to take more space offline or to curb new construction in a measurable way so that you don't have that counterbalance against all of your efforts of new space coming online and requiring environmental inputs. Excuse me. Okay, so we know that there's not much demolition happening across campus. What is getting demolished tends to be small buildings. The next thing that we decided to track was look at construction and demolition waste. Within the STARS reporting system, we found that just about a third plus of institutions were not able to track the amount of construction and demolition waste coming out of their campus. Just short of 2/3 were able to. So the first opportunity that we pinpointed in this regard was that just tracking the waste could make us better informed about the impact that we're having by completing construction and demolition activities on campus from an emissions perspective. For those third that aren't able to track their C&D waste, there's a great resource available from the National Institute of Building Science. You can type in the zip code of your institution and actually find local haulers who are willing to take demolition material. Say you take down a building and you have wood, concrete, doors, asphalt. You can search by material, by location to find vendors who would be willing to not just pick up that material but also divert it. The good news about diversion is that of those about 2/3 that are able to track their C&D waste, they report average diversion of that waste from landfill to be just above 75%. And interestingly, tying back once more to this idea of having formal frameworks in place, the LEED BD&C rating system actually awards points based on the amount of C&D waste diverted from landfill. And the performance across the STARS database is just above that threshold to earn maximum points within LEED. So after analyzing this data, our team was feeling like this was another place where having that formal structure of the LEED rating system has been beneficial to the industry because it's almost become the norm to just aim for the amount of diversion that can earn you optimal points in that system. So you might be thinking construction and demolition waste, doesn't this really go across all phases of the life cycle? It really can. In this regard, we want to think about it in terms of actually demolishing buildings. You saw in the early chart that there's a peak in emissions attributable to that. And you might say, well, why would we want to take down a building when it's going to lead to a spike in emissions. I always like to advocate when we're having these conversations that it's a short-term spike that would reduce the overall long-term leak in emissions, if you will, that's attributable to keeping a building online for a long time but underused. So with that, we've covered some of the key findings of data across those 4 life cycles. Of course, those of you who have read the report know that there's so much more and so many more topics that are really food for thought for sustainability professionals. We hope to keep that dialogue going, but first I'm going to be handing back the microphone to Jen Andrews, my colleague, who will be talking about the key findings and where we go from here. Because it's one thing to look at the data and to know how we're performing and which parts of the life cycle we might be falling a little bit behind on, but it's really another to come up with a strategic vision forward for continuous improvement, for making sure that we're really embedding sustainability principles across the built environment life cycle whenever possible. So with that, I will let Jen take it away.
Thanks, Heather. You can actually just go right on to the next slide then. So how do we kind of wrap all of this up and think about it, as Heather said, in the context of, so what do we do? In terms of wrapping it up, in terms of sort of trying to synthesize it and understand it together, as opposed to just sort of individual data points, one kind of exercise that we did in putting together the report was to kind of numerically put all of that data together and crunch this this matrix, this heat map. This is something that you can do actually in Excel. So it's based on numbers. It wasn't sort of an arbitrary assignation of colors. But this is an attempt to sort of sum up what we found in terms of the degree to which people are measuring emissions, again carbon, the degree to which institutional policies are or aren't common, and the degree to which institutions are performing well or less well across the 4 stages of the life cycle. So the green indicates categories where there was widespread adoption of best practices or measurable improvement in outcomes. So, on the construction side, as we sort of noted before, more and more policies, policies are relatively common and the performance is relatively good. I mean, that's, we're doing well on that front. We're now measuring it. That's the red. The red is a sort of minimal adoption of kind of leading practices. And then the orange, as you might imagine, or yellow, is kind of in the middle. It's modest adoption or improvement. So it's a little bit, where there are examples of leadership and clear kind of paths being broken, but not yet widespread adoption. And so, and that's the case in terms of in the policy arena for every life cycle phase other than construction, and it's the case in terms of how we're actually performing around capital reinvestment and demolition. So what does all of this mean then in terms of what do we need to do? The 3 major recommendations, which I think might be, especially the last 2, rather intuitive to many of you, but it's nice to have the data to kind of see, okay, this is, how does my experience on my individual campus or this experience on this individual campus compare to the experiences of everyone across the U.S. in this case. This is U.S. data. So based on that composite look, we have these 3 recommendations. And the first is that we really do need to do a better job of reporting, which of course is easy for me to say because in working with the carbon calculator and carbon map over the years, I have been very involved in helping develop the methodologies and standards and recommendations. So if that's on anyone, it's on me. And it's not on anyone. It's not to say that anyone is doing anything wrong. The standards and protocols that we have for a reason. Partly they're the standards and protocols that other sectors have had and that have developed internationally. And so as a sector, we've been trying to be in alignment with those. But again, those have been developed two thoughts in mind, primarily helping enforce regulations if and when they exist around carbon, and helping facilitate markets for carbon-related projects, renewable energy, but especially carbon offsets. And so those are useful and important standards, but if we want to take a view that goes beyond markets or regulation, that is, if we want to look at our emissions from something beyond a perspective of liability and really start thinking about it in terms of leadership, then it opens up the potential to do more. If we were going to do more, that would mean we would need two things to help facilitate that. We're not really set up to do it now. And so the two things we would need would be, one, we would need to sort of change how we approach our emissions. And so in the report, you'll see a suggestion, an op-ed from Chris Stewart from Millersville University, who writes about how it might make sense to treat Scope 1 and 2 emissions very differently than our Scope 3 emissions, which I think makes a lot of sense. But we need to work together as a sector to figure out what does that mean and what does that look like, and how would we change how we think and talk about our carbon footprint as not sort of one monolithic thing, but as an indicator that has some nuance and gradations. And so we need to do that in order to include all of our Scope 3 emissions and not just a subset of them. The other thing that we need to be able to enable that is better tools, because partly we've been limited by the tools that we have. And so, for example, one of the things that we're working on for the new version of Carbon Map that's going to be released later this year is the addition of modules to account for the rest of Scope 3 sources, like purchase goods and upstream energy and investments. And the purchase goods may be sort of broken out by type, like food or construction procurement or what have you. And there are other tools that are being developed to do that as well. But one thing that came through really clearly in putting this report together is that it could be really powerful and helpful for us to understand better what the emissions impacts of our choices are, especially the choices to build, as well as how to build. So that's the first one. The second one, once those buildings are built, we really do need to adapt our policies and to focus on comprehensive management strategies for our existing buildings. We can't afford, from an environmental perspective or a financial perspective, to keep doing it sort of piecemeal or ad hoc. It is not sustainable in any sense. And so there are great new tools coming out, like USGBC's new ARC program, that should make it easier to do that sort of real-time tracking and to sort of roll that up into something that allows you to be more comprehensive in your approach. There are also great examples of policies, like a couple of the policies outlined in the report, an example of a no net growth policy, example of sustainable building management policies. And those of you who, like me, are sort of focused on Princeton Review and Sierra Club STARS reporting deadlines, some of those existing building policies may be giving you headaches, but they're such important policies. And so one of the findings of this report is that really collectively that's an area of a lot of opportunity for all of us, and that hopefully working together we can find a way that works for all of us and learn from each other. And that's really the last recommendation, which is we've done so much great work, but we have so much work to do. And that's kind of the good news, bad news of this, is that the better we do, the better we can do, right? So I just want to say UNH is really committed to working with all of you to learn and experiment and grow together on these fronts. And we really believe that higher ed can lead, and that we can benefit, like from a business perspective, we can benefit. Like we can have more sustainable institutions if we really do focus on these things. But that we also have an opportunity to lead because we are institutions that are here for the longer term with broad teaching missions, and so we have both, in some ways, some luxuries and some resources and some responsibilities that sectors like business and government don't have. And so we have real opportunities to continue to make our individual campuses more sustainable, but also to have that be sort of transformative beyond the higher ed sector. So with that, I want to thank you again, all of you, for your leadership and for your hard work day to day. And it looks like we have a few minutes for questions yet and comments. And I think I need to turn it back over to Eric to facilitate that for us, please.
Okay, thank you, Jen, and thank you, Heather. Well, that wraps up the content of today's session, and looks like we have about 5 minutes left, so we may try to go over a little bit. I hope that the majority of you can stick with us during that time. So let's get right to the questions, as we have several of them, and we'll attempt to address as many as we can. So let's get started. So the first question that came in during the introduction, the background. So the question is simply, how did you get your endowment for sustainability work? I think that may have been for Jen.
That was for UNH. Yeah, I mean, we luck and some forethought and cultivation. It's not as though we were going out looking for it. We had an alum who came to us and said, I want to give something that will support sustainability on and beyond the campus. And it needs to be, I don't know if he used the word sustainability, but he said it needs to be, across disciplines, and it needs to be across environmental and social. He was talking about sustainability clearly. And so at first I will say that I don't think our foundation knew exactly what to do with that, but we had great academic and overall institutional leadership, and in the course of over a year we sort of had a conversation with him about what that would look like and what that would mean, and the upshot of it all was that his gift meant to support this office in perpetuity. So I don't know if that's terribly helpful.
No, it's great.
I don't know how replicable it is, but that's possible.
Next question, that came up during the theoretical emissions profile chart. I think it was slide 10. With this model, can we estimate how much operating emissions might increase if capital reinvestment is deferred?
Awesome. Not yet, but I'd love to think about how to make that happen, how to work that in there. No, it's a great research question. I'm writing it down. And whoever that was, I'd love to work with you on thinking about how to model that.
Okay. Next one, is there any correlation between preventative maintenance spending and energy reductions?
That's a great question, and if your institution is a Sightlines member, you probably see quite a bit of data about preventative maintenance. It is part of our central dogma. Take good care of the buildings you have, extend the life cycles as far as they will stretch. It actually is a component of this year's report, and what we're proud to report is that institutions have increased the percent of their budget spent on preventative maintenance over time from 2007 to 2015, and we believe that some of that energy performance improvement is really a direct result of that focus on preventative maintenance. And frankly, I think preventative maintenance is going to be even more important in the years ahead, because some institutions with tough financial situations will not be able to tackle all of those needs all at once. So it's going to need to be a strategic decision on campus about what equipment you maintain to the best of your ability versus what equipment must be replaced here and now and today. So it's a great avenue for sustainability professionals to really advocate for a low-cost solution to some sustainability struggles that come out of the operating side of campus.
Okay, thanks, Heather. Next question, have you noticed a correlation between campuses with significant cogen or other on-site generation initiatives and energy GHG performance? Like, had they performed better than those with less on-site generation?
So there's some great case studies here, and in fact, I think in the coming days in the material that will be shared with your institution, you'll receive, or with all the attendees, you'll receive a case study about an institution in a particularly dirty grid region. And when that institution moved towards a cogen model, their electricity reduced in emissions per MMBTU drastically, because the electricity they were producing on their own on-site equipment at the plant was significantly cleaner, if you will, than what they could possibly buy from the grid that is making very little progress in fuel switching.
Okay, thank you,
So
Heather.
keep your eyes peeled on your...
If I can actually take on to that briefly,
yeah.
Not as part of this analysis, but as a follow-up project where we're digging in a little bit on some renewable energy data and also some broader campus energy trends, just looking at some of our carbon map data. We have been looking a little bit at broadly the emissions trends for cogen campuses versus non-cogen campuses, and there are clear benefits to cogen. In the short run, one of the interesting things we're seeing in that renewables analysis is that the flip side of that is that we see fewer campuses who have cogen looking at or able to benefit from renewable energy purchasing opportunities or project opportunities, and starting to see that potentially be a limiting factor around like energy security and adaptation and resilience. So it's an interesting, the data is interesting, and I hope to have more on that when we publish that renewable energy work later this year.
Okay, thank you, Jen. The last question, the next question and last question so far, seems like it's a multi-parter. So as universities face budget cuts, either due to cuts in state funding or incoming students, what are your thoughts then on administration planning to demolish buildings to save costs on, or to save operational costs? Do you think that is a greater environmental impact in terms of carbon, and would it take away from carbon neutrality goals, or how would that impact those goals? And that was asked during slide 27. That was the construction versus demolition slide.
Mm-hmm. I really look at demolitions as a short-term carbon issue. So that year, that time period in which the demolition is occurring, I'm going to call it a carbon bomb, essentially, and having to dispose of all that material and go through the process of demolition. But that being said, when you think of it from a long-term perspective, not an upfront carbon cost, but a long-term carbon cost, it's actually, in my mind, far worse to keep a building online long-term to avoid that burst of emissions, because that building might sit on your campus for another 50 years, operating below par and below full usage if you don't have high enrollment at that time, and basically leaking carbon year over year over year just to keep it open and operating. So when you are trying to make the case for that on your campus, I always recommend, just like on a financial analysis, that you don't just look at the upfront cost, but you look at the long-term cost and avoidance associated with making those decisions.
Okay, thanks, Heather. It looks like that's it for now, so we only went a couple minutes over. So before we sign off, I would just like to let you all know that you will be receiving a post-webinar survey at the conclusion of today's session. It's just a quick 7 or 8 question survey that should probably only take about a minute or two to complete. And it's really designed to not only get your thoughts on the content of today's presentation, but to also get a sense for the challenges that you face on campus. And with those in mind, what topics you'd like to hear from us at future events and in future reports. So we'd really love to hear from you about that. So it looks like we have addressed everything, all the questions that have been submitted. So I'd like to thank you all again for joining us today. I hope that you enjoyed the session and found the information valuable as you continue to explore ways to transform your sustainability strategy and create a new facilities conversation on your campus. Please don't hesitate to contact us via our website, sightlines.com, or directly at insights@sightlines.com if you have any additional questions for either Jen or Heather following today's call. So thank you again, and I hope you all have a great day.